We have people who say there are iron laws of history. I know that there are. I'm dead certain that there are. The challenge is to formulate them. And there's a pernicious element of lack of awareness of their fallibility and also insufficient methodological knowledge.
I think there's a propensity in a lot of people's minds, I'm not like this, but lots and lots of people are, is to sort of endlessly seek the perfect answer to things and to be convinced that there is one in the first place, and then to endlessly seek it. Again, perhaps in maths or physics, it's a different case. Perhaps that is possible. You know, I'm told the elegance of certain equations and certain mathematical proofs and things. But when it comes to, but when it comes to the study of history, it's much more murky. It's much more difficult. You talk about sort of iron laws of history. I don't know. You talked there about Hegel a bit and Marx. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Marx was a Hegelian to a degree. I mean, talk about the dialectic and all sorts of things. He borrowed from Hegel heavily. Let's say that, at least. What I'd like to do is, if I can, use a couple of actual historical examples.
Yeah, by all means.
To try and make sense of what we're talking about here, because maybe it's a bit abstract for people, what we're talking about. If I could take two examples of something that happened in history. One, Robert Clive on the eve of the Battle of Plassey, and two, Harold Godwinson getting an arrow in the eye at Hastings. Okay, these are two examples. Clive of India, Robert Clive, found himself in India in the 18th century, facing a giant army. He was outnumbered many, many times over. And it seemed suicidal to accept the battle. And he asked his small inner entourage of officer corps, just a handful of men, should we accept battle tomorrow or not? And nearly all of them said, no, of course not. That's crazy. That's crazy that you're even considering it. And anyway, he took himself off into sort of a grove somewhere on his own and mulled it over for a while and came to the decision that, no, we are going to have a battle. Anyway, next day, there's a Battle of Plassey, and no one would deny that history massively changed as an effect of that battle. A massively important battle that changed the course of world history, not just English and Indian history. So, what Robert Clive did in those few minutes of mulling it over on his own, completely on his own, just in his own head, making that decision. And some people would say, I would say, there's an example of the great man of history, or when an individual person in his mind and all his emotions and things changed history. Now, some people might argue, but no, Robert Clive was always just the product of his class and his time and his race and his gender and his upbringing, and he was always going to make that decision. He was never not going to make that decision in that moment. Okay, all right. Well, maybe you can make that argument. It's an argument to be made. I don't agree with it, but you can make the argument, and historians can argue about that over a pint endlessly. Okay, well, then what about the example of Harold getting an arrow in the eye? Well, being shot in the head and killed. Most historians agree that the shield wall at Hastings on Senlac Hill, if it was indeed on Senlac Hill, at Hastings, near Battle Abbey, that the Normans couldn't break down the shield wall. They tried again and again all day long and couldn't break it down. And it wasn't until the shield wall broke and chased them down the hill, and then the Norman cavalry turned and the day changed. Now, Harold being killed on the field, getting that arrow in the eye, seems to have absolutely changed the day as well. That from that point on, the battle was lost. The esprit de corps, the morale of the Anglo-Saxons, the English, was broken at that point, and thus William of Normandy won, and so on. Again, no one denies that all of history pivoted on that point. So, wait, the difference between getting an arrow in the eye and it missing you could be like this much. So history changed, you could argue, that history pivoted on the trajectory of an arrow by a slight gust of wind while the arrow was in the air, should we say, maybe. Well, did class forces affect the trajectory of that arrow? That's a much more difficult argument to make, isn't it? When somebody is very nearly assassinated, but they're not assassinated, was that to do with class and gender and their upbringing and their emotions? There's an example when Franklin D. Roosevelt, when he was vice president, missed being assassinated by a couple of minutes, just because a few different people's journey through physically through the world, if it had been a couple of minutes different, FDR may well have been assassinated before he even became president. That's much so there's a few examples really, and people must know it in their own lives. In fact, sort of the sliding doors effect of reality, the way the real world is, the way reality is. One tiny little example. One time, many years ago, probably 20 odd years ago now, I came out of a pub and I was a bit drunk. I'd had 4 or 5 pints. I wasn't completely smashed, but I was a bit drunk. And I walked out into the road and a bus missed me by what must have been millimetres. The side of the tyre of the bus touched my shoe. I felt the wind of it. It must have missed my face by millimetres. And I don't think the bus driver even saw me. I didn't see the bus. I don't know how I didn't see or hear it. I was a bit drunk. The bus driver didn't beep his horn or anything. I don't think he saw me. Anyway, if my journey physically through the world had been this much or even that much further, I may well have been killed. And that is reality though, isn't it? That's what life is like. Okay, now, did the difference between me being this much further forward than I was have anything to do with class forces, with the conception of history that someone like Spengler or Marx even would have? It doesn't seem like it is, does it? That doesn't seem like the correct way of looking at it. Another very quick example. There's a story of Napoleon in Spain in the Peninsular War. And he was chasing an English army, Sir John Moore's army, back up to Corunna. And at a certain point, he gets a message from Paris saying, there's some political shenanigans going on in Paris. We would like you to come back to Paris and deal with it. And most historians say he absolutely didn't have to do that. His position politically was stable enough that he didn't have to do that. He could have carried on campaigning in Spain. And everyone knows that Napoleon's hat is worth 50,000 men on the field. He was easily the best tactician and strategist, far better than any of his marshals. Anyway, again, he took a moment aside on his own, just sitting on a wall, just pondering, just with his own thoughts about whether to continue in Spain or to go back to Paris. And he decided to go back to Paris. And again, lots of historians say history pivoted there on that individual decision that one man made in that moment. It changed the course of events, sort of massively, really undeniably. So, whether you would argue Napoleon was always going to make that decision because of more general forces at play in history. For me, like the Plassey example, Robert Clive in India, I find it a difficult argument to make. It doesn't seem right to me.
Do you think it's like cope?
I think maybe. Like I say, I think there's lots of people, they're obsessed with this idea that they can know perfectly not only what's happened, but what will happen.
Yeah.
They've sort of fallen into, to me, seems wrong-headed, or a sort of an intellectual cul-de-sac, that you can know that the future's sort of inevitable. I just think it's wrong.
Same. And I think if we look...
But one last thing I'll just say, I might be wrong about that. I'm prepared to admit that I could be wrong. But that's sort of what I'm saying. You can't be certain about anything, really.
So I wanted us to ponder a bit on explanation again and see how these views of explanation have changed and how people use them in order to create the narratives of inevitable progress or inevitable decay. So we started with saying that there is this view that posits a necessitarian view of the universe. It says that all there is intelligible. To render something intelligible, to understand something, you must see it as part of a system that necessitates it. Therefore, you instantly have a necessitarian worldview. Everything is rigidly necessitated, at least a deterministic one, because there are some details we don't need to get into right now. But there is such a thing as understanding in patterns, and sometimes we really feel that we need to find patterns in order to raise our understanding about things. But the question is, though, whether there's a difference between the heuristic use of a particular principle and the actual commitment to its metaphysical truth. Let me give you an example. So there's a principle of explanation called the principle of sufficient reason. Not everyone accepts it. But it says that everything that exists, there are all sorts of versions, but let's say one version is that every fact there is a sufficient cause why every fact is as it is, as opposed to it being any other way, and as to why any event happened as it happened and at the time it happened, as opposed to it happening in any other way and at another time. And this basically says that it is committed at least to a form of determinism. So the problem with this here is that we don't know, we don't have the epistemic warrant to say that everything is intelligible and everything is intelligible in that sense. It is an article of faith. It is a methodological assumption. Now, what I want to say is that heuristically speaking, as a tool for doing something, it is incredibly helpful. But because, for instance, when we try to understand something, like for instance, why an engine malfunctioned, we want to repair it. Maybe we're in a plane and there is a problem with one engine and we instantly need to repair it. We need to think this way. We need to, because this seems to be the way in which this will be sorted. So it helps us in, for instance, our effort to terraform, let's say, Earth around us, and to, let's say, conquer material nature, the material nature. It does help us to understand it and to at least posit the assume that we can understand it. Because it's like, who said it? Was it Bacon? Francis Bacon, who said that nature to be commanded but must first be obeyed. I think that
sounds right.
Yeah, so we need to understand how some patterns in order to do this. There's no other way. But there's a very big difference, a methodological difference between saying that I will assume that there is a sufficient explanation, and there may be, in order for me to work and operate, and quite another thing to say I will metaphysically assume, I will assume that it's a metaphysical truth that there is a sufficient explanation for things, or that the universe is necessitated. So I think that, again, these are methodological issues that it's good to ponder about, to think about, especially when we hear people being very certain about historical claims. Because very frequently, especially in the public sphere, we do hear people who they do want to claim a sort of prestige for themselves, and very frequently they make very large claims that they're unwarranted. And not many people can say that, can understand why they're unwarranted, and that is why I think it's really important to get this point across. Because sometimes, there is such a thing as sometimes people say things to be relevant and sometimes they're not justified. And a lot of people, they rush and believe them. It's
common, isn't it?
It's like the one-eyed rules the blind. So I think that this is something to say, and it's important to get this message across, that not everything is doomed and not everything is also fated to happen well. So what I think is that any person, even if there is necessity in the world, any person who comes and says, there is an inevitable progress that will happen, or an inevitable doom, they're methodologically speaking not right. If they say that I've made an informed judgment, and what I think is that it is most probable to happen, then that's methodologically speaking right. Yeah. But there's again the difference between saying this will happen on the one hand and saying that most probably this will happen, which means that it's not inevitable.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.